Hi guys, now today we're going to concentrate on the opening of our novel, The Weight of Water. Okay, so to get organised, make sure that you have a sheet in front of you, hopefully a pen, and you need, maybe if you're using your copy, a double page. Okay, so you're going to be focusing on 6 different aspects of the opening here, and we have to decide, is it a good or successful opening or not? If so, why? If not, why not? So we ask ourselves, what is the function or purpose of the opening? So that's the key word then, function. Okay, and remember, for something to function, it means that something works, essentially. So you have to decide then by the end of our discussion whether you consider this to be a successful opening. Is it intriguing enough? Is it dramatic enough? Does it make you want to read on? And if so, why? If not, why not? So your personal response is going to be just as important as the facts and the key information here. Okay, so number 1, we write down that it establishes setting. Basically, it gives us the information as to where the story takes place. Okay, so at the very beginning then, when we're reading, the title of the chapter is Leaving Gdansk Główny. So Gdansk, of course, is the seaport that we mentioned the last day in Poland, and Główny, of course, just literally means in Polish then the main train station, so the railway station. Okay, so it's mentioned at the very, very beginning. Then we move on to Stansted Airport in London, and then finally to Coventry. Okay, so basic setting then, and we can jot that down as we're going along. So number 2 then is that it outlines the plot. Okay, so it gives us a sense then of the storyline, the events, of course, the episodes as such. So what is happening in the story or what is going to happen throughout. And remember, we do get little clues essentially as well. Sometimes we had that word before, foreshadowing, okay, where it gives you a little hint as to what's going to happen later on in the novel. And we have to pick up on those particular clues and deduce what's going to happen. So it's quite mysterious and quite intriguing as such then. And sometimes we can work out what's going to happen much later in the novel if we use our intelligence and if we're able to pick up on those particular clues and use a bit of imagination and creativity as well. Okay, so it sets the plot in motion. It kind of kick-starts the plot. And then you have this domino effect then, where the different events then begin to affect one another. Okay, so we'll come back to that later then. If we find anything as we're reading through, we can just fill in the blanks. Number 3 then, it outlines the characters and their relationships. So we get a good sense then of the main relationship between Kasienka and her mother at the very beginning then. The first 3 chapters, we'll say, will be the opening or the introduction then to the novel. So what we can do is we can focus on characteristics or traits, the attributes that we observe then. So who are these people and what are they like? What is the nature of their relationship? How strong a bond do they actually have or share? Okay, so basic information then, you can jot it down as we're going through. And remember, you can add in your own ideas as well, because this is just sort of an overview. Okay, we could spend 2 or 3 classes just looking at the introduction or the opening. Right, number 4 then, the opening suggests different ideas or themes or issues. Okay, so remember we were saying before that emigration is obviously a very powerful theme in this. Okay, so the individual, of course, who is displaced and has to try and adjust to a different world, a different society. So family is a very important theme, remember, in this particular book and other books by Sarah Crossan. The mother-daughter relationship. Okay, romantic love. There are so many different themes, and you should be able to just jot down different ideas then that come to you as you're reading the introduction. Number 5 then would be, does the opening intrigue the reader? I-N-T-R-I-G-U-E. Does it interest you? Does it hold your attention? So some people say, oh, this is kind of boring and dull, like nothing much happens as such. Other people say, oh, maybe the style is kind of interesting enough. It's kind of quirky and unusual. Why does she use these verse paragraphs? Why is it written in the form of a poem or the style of a poem? And other people kind of say, okay, well, this is different. You know, she's writing about a young Polish girl who comes to London. And then we're given kind of clues as to, or suggestions as to what's happened to her father as well. So that's kind of intriguing. We kind of go, okay, plot detail there is kind of intriguing to me anyway, because some people like reading novels that have a good punchy story. Some people like reading novels then where they can identify with the characters. Other people like the style of the novel. essentially. You know, the language that is used, the imagery and so on. They really appreciate that. Okay, so that's number 5. And then number 6, then essentially, how it establishes the style, the techniques used by the author. So you should be able to identify 4 or 5 different techniques that really stand out when you're reading the introduction of the novel itself. Okay, remember we have 3 parts to the novel and we have an epilogue. So we have, of course, a number of short chapters here. So what we're going to do is kind of condense then the first 3 chapters into our opening, and we're going to kind of analyze those then as we're reading through. So basically I have this on Kindle, like I mentioned before. You can see that. So this is the first chapter, and just the title, Leaving Gdansk Glowny. So at the very beginning, she mentions the suitcase. And think about it, the suitcase here becomes a very important symbol. It represents the idea, of course, of a voyage, travel, essentially. And we realize, of course, that they are leaving home, that they are leaving their homeland, they're leaving Poland far behind. So it's mentioned the wheels on the suitcase break before we've even left the train station. So think about it, what does that suggest? Well, it may suggest, of course, that they have a cheap suitcase. Are they too poor then to afford an expensive suitcase? Okay, and there are clues then, of course, when she mentions it's hard for Mama carrying a suitcase and a bulging laundry bag. And you can, that's kind of unusual. Most people wouldn't be lugging around their belongings in a laundry bag, and especially going to the airport as well. So would that suggest they're too poor to afford a second suitcase, a large suitcase, a new suitcase as well? Definitely clues there just in terms of their background and lack of opportunity and lack of money. And that's confirmed later on, of course, when it comes to the setting then in Coventry, where they're both living, of course, in the 1-bedroom apartment and they're both sleeping in the same bed. So all of the clues there essentially helping us to understand who they are, where they come from, what their circumstances are like. Okay, the wheels on suitcase breaking, is that symbolic? Do you think we could add that to style, maybe? Sort of the idea that it might suggest a broken relationship. Or maybe it alludes to, we'd say, the mother's relationship with the father later on as well. So all these kind of hints, essentially. Or it might suggest maybe a little bit of conflict then, of course, between the mother and Kasienka, the daughter herself. The wheels on the suitcase, does it represent the idea that there's no going back? Okay, that once they move to England, that's it. They're not returning as such. Okay, notice the use of, we'd say, the fragmented lines here as well. Mama knocks on them some steps and bang, crack, rattle. No more use. There are plastic bits everywhere. So I think that's very clever because it does suggest the idea then of pulling something down a step and then it judders, essentially. It bounces from one step to the next. It's almost like the lines are bouncing from one line to the next, from one place to the next. Or the idea of the broken wheels kind of splintering and they're in tiny little fragments, and you get fragments of lines there as well. You have to kind of ask yourself, of course, then for style, why does she use a poem? Think about it. Poetry is very dramatic and very intense. The lines are very contracted. Think of prose, sentences and paragraphs. Poetry then, lines and verses. Okay, so it makes it much more immediate and personal, makes it much more dramatic when you use a verse or a poem rather than just writing sentences and paragraphs here. Okay, so what kind of impression do we get of Kasienka's mother, first of all? She says it's hard for Mama watching, with everyone watching. She's shy about the laundry bag. So maybe she's a proud woman, of course. She doesn't want people to know that she doesn't have that much money. The laundry bag was an old nylon one borrowed from Babcia, so it wasn't even their own, essentially. That's kind of intriguing as well. So I'm kind of wondering, are they on the run? Like, what exactly is happening here? Why? Why are they traveling from Poland? And who is Babcia as well? So you could say that creates a sense of intrigue then from point number 5. That makes you think, that keeps you going, makes you want to read on, essentially, to find out more about the characters and to find out why they're leaving Poland. Tata took all the good luggage when he left us, when he walked out on Mama and me. Okay, that's relating back to point number 2 then, the plot, the storyline, a sense of intrigue maybe for number 5 as well. Okay, Tata, that suggests the father, essentially. Why did he leave? And where did he go? And are they following him? Are they tracking him? Are they trying to find him? What's the story there? What happened between her parents for her father to leave? And remember, she mentions that he walked out on Mama and me as well. Does that help us to understand then how she feels about her father later on? And we get the sense, of course, that she tries to track him down. Okay, the dialogue is very, very simple then. It's very ordinary. It just gives you a sense then of the intimacy, the bond between mother and daughter here. So it says, of course, that Mama won't let me carry a thing except my own small bag. She says, you guard our passports, Kasienka. Good girl, Kasienka. And the money. Good girl. So we see how protective she is of her daughter. The fact that she doesn't want her daughter to be lugging the suitcase around, to be dragging bags everywhere. So we can see that the mother then is kind of proud and sort of protective as such then. We also notice at the very beginning that we have a first person narrator. We have Kasienka then telling the story. It's not the omniscient third person narrator, it's the first person narrator. So we would jot that down then under number 6, essentially, as part then of that particular aspect. Okay, so we get the sense Ma prattles. We get the sense that she talks quite a lot, or she just talks on, and Kasienka more or less ignores her for most of it. I scuttle along her. Very particular use of the word scuttle there as well. It's just kind of dodging, she says here, the business suits and backpacks and so on. Scuttling would suggest almost like a crab as well, moving very, very quickly. Okay, so we just get a sense then that they board the bus for the airport, and it says, while I cling to the belt of her coat, too old for holding hands, even if she had one free. So there is the sense here then, of course, that Kasienka depends on her mother very much, but we also get the sense, of course, that Kasienka is trying to break free from her mother to a certain degree, that she's growing up. And then we learn later on, of course, that she's 12 going on 13. So she's in that kind of in-between stage, that kind of tweeny stage, essentially. She's no longer a child, but she's not a proper teenager either. Okay, the next chapter then entitled Stansted. And we see at the very beginning here, we get a sense that Kasienka is a very intelligent and educated girl. She gives us information here. We weren't on a ship. Immigrants don't arrive on overcrowded boats anymore. Keyword immigrants, of course, they're not just going on holiday. Swarming wet docks like rats. It isn't 1920 and it isn't Ellis Island. Nothing as romantic as a view of Lady Liberty to welcome us. She knows her history. Okay, she knows that Ellis Island, of course, was the place where all other people coming into America had to be processed essentially before they were allowed and accepted into America. So Ellis Island then was that particular area. And obviously, of course, millions of Irish people went through Ellis Island in order then, of course, to get to America. Lady Liberty, of course, a reference then to the Statue of Liberty, obviously given to the Americans by France. Okay, so we get a sense then that she's quite intelligent and quite educated. So she explains then how they flew into Stansted, okay, and then how nervous they were essentially too. And then we get the pride of the mother coming into place here again, where the mother then looks at the laundry bag going round and round on the carousel, and she feels embarrassed and ashamed. So then she lies to Kasienka. She says, oh, leave it, there's nothing in that bag but long underwear. Obviously, you're linking back to Poland, of course, and it's cold climate, especially in the winter. We won't need them here. We'll need galoshes. Now, the word galosh, of course, or galoshes, is actually quite old-fashioned, really, even the concept itself. Nowadays, most people would just wear wellies or Wellington boots. Galoshes then just basically are kind of thick, waterproof coverings that you'd pull them on over your shoes, over your trainers, so over other shoes. So you wouldn't take your shoes off and then put on a pair of galoshes. You put the galoshes over. So that's a kind of a very sort of English old-fashioned term there as well. So she says, Mama is right. The air in England is swampy, kind of thick, damp, oppressive. The sky, a grey blanket. Notice the use of metaphor there. So the language is actually very poetic in keeping with the verse paragraphs. So the sky, a grey blanket. Once more, it's very dull. It's very dreary as such. Does that reflect her mood? Think about it. She's very nervous. She's very tense. She's homesick. We really get a sense of that. And rain threatens to drench us. Notice how she's using personification here, as if the rain becomes a malevolent or evil creature. So rain threatens to drench us. And she does mention the rain again and again throughout the novel. basically kind of exasperated at how cold and damp England is and how unused to that she is, of course, when it comes to Poland and its climate. Okay, so we get a little bit more detail then in terms of the setting. Remember that we had Gdansk Glowny, then we had Stansted, and now we have Coventry. So we're going to focus on the one-bedroom flat here. Mama rented a room in Coventry. This is where we'll live until we find Tata. So we get a sense, okay, that helps us to understand more then about why they're here and what they intend to do. So they're trying to track him down then, essentially. That's going to be the basis of the story, or at least we understand that from this particular chapter. Okay, important detail then, one room on the 4th floor of a crumbling building. Crumbling, of course, means that it's kind of like old and shabby, dilapidated. Okay, so it's not very new, and you wouldn't imagine, of course, that'd be very expensive either. It reminds me of history class, reminds me of black and white photographs of bombed out villages. And if you think about it, that's very ironic as such, because Coventry, of course, was bombed during the Second World War and they had to rebuild most of it. It's known, of course, for having a very beautiful cathedral as well, so it's right in the middle of England. There's a white kitchen in the room, in the corner, and one big bed. So we realise, of course, that it's an open plan apartment or flat, really. It's a studio apartment, of course, as the mother says. So one big bed, as I said, they have to share it. So emphasise the fact, of course, they can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Lumpy in the middle, like a cold pierogi. So lumpy in the middle, of course, would suggest obviously an old kind of battered mattress. Like a cold pierogi, notice the use of a simile there. A pierogi, of course, is a Polish dumpling. So a cold, kind of a soggy, lumpy dumpling, essentially very uncomfortable. You can imagine, of course, it'd be very difficult to get a good night's sleep then if you're lying on that particular mattress. And emphasising then for Ma and me to share. Okay, so it's reinforcing then, of course, their circumstances, reinforcing their lack of money, and just simply reinforcing the setting. It's just one room, I said. What I mean is, we can't live here. It's called a studio, that tells me, as though a word can change the truth. Notice how perceptive and observant Kasienka is here. It really shows how clever she is. She knows when she's being lied to. She knows when her mother, of course, is trying to make the best of things. She knows when her mother is using a euphemism like studio instead of a grotty 1-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. Mama stands by the dirty window with her back to me. Even think of the little details here, a dirty window, it's grimy. It kind of reinforces then, of course, how unkempt the place is. Looking out at the droning traffic, so you can hear the horrible noises, of course, then obviously from the traffic outside. The Coventry Ring Road, very, very busy, 24/7. Constant stream of traffic. Think of the tooting of horns then as well. Even think of the pollution. All of that, of course, is very negative. Then she marches to the kitchen and plugs in the small electric kettle. Even idea those tiny details, a small electric kettle. She boils the water twice. Why does she do that? She's a bit suspicious, of course, as the water is not that clean. And makes 2 mugs of tea. One for her, one for me. Like home, she says. In other words, she's trying to be positive. She's trying to be optimistic, of course, because she's thinking about her daughter and her daughter's feelings. So it's really sort of emphasising the bond between them, and it's emphasising what a good mother she is too. So, supping the tea, staring into its blackness. Mama found the perfect home for a cast-off laundry bag. Yes, but not a home for us. And we can imagine, of course, the laundry bag is still going round and round and round on the carousel. But in a way, of course, Kasienka envies that laundry bag. The laundry bag was abandoned. Remember, of course, they've been abandoned by Tata. So it's the idea, of course, that it's not really a home now. They've been kind of displaced. Think of the poor old laundry bag going round and round and round on the carousel. And in a way, it could represent or symbolise Kasienka. She just feels confused, out of place, as if she's going around and around, of course, and there's no progress being made. So that's just a kind of a general overview then of the first 3 chapters. And remember, what you can do is, as you're reading through and listening to this as well, you can fill in any of the details then for the 6 points. Now, I know that point number 6 is going to be the most difficult one because a lot of people find style very difficult. So what you could do is you could simply jot down, there are, of course, 3 parts and an epilogue to this particular novel. Sarah Crossan uses short, bite-sized chapters. there's a first person narrator. She writes it in the form of verse paragraphs. Okay, so it's written out as a long, detailed poem as such. Okay, and think about the first person narrator, for example. What are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantage of using a first person narrator, Kasienka, the main character, is that it's very personal, it's very intimate, it's very immediate, it can be quite dramatic at times. It's revelatory. It reveals a lot about her and her relationships. It reveals quite a lot, of course, about how she's thinking and what she's feeling. So it gives you that inner voice as such. The disadvantage would be then that's a bit biased. Okay, think about the stories from her point of view. We don't get to know an awful lot about the other characters and how they're really thinking or feeling, only sometimes when she's describing them, and sometimes when we have to read between the lines as well. So it's a little bit more limited when you have a first person narrator as opposed to a third person narrator when you have the author, Sarah Crossan, telling the story. Okay, so you would look, of course, at the language that is used. Why is it used? You would look then, of course, at the use of similes, metaphors, and personification, as I did. So symbols, perhaps, then as well. You can look at description and use of dialogue. Okay, so you actually have quite a lot to consider when you're focusing on style and technique. Maybe whittle it down, we'd say, to 3 or 4 more manageable points. Focus on the things that you would find a bit more interesting, or focus on the things that you would find easier to write about again. Okay, so the next time then what we're going to have a look at is we're going to have a look at the main character, Kasienka herself. So we're going to have a look at her traits, her attributes, her appearance, and maybe her role as well, her role and function in the novel. So that will be in some detail. So try your best to get as much reading done as possible before then. See you then, guys. Take care.